Tom Robinson. He's a retired pastor, not pastor, professor is the word. Fairly recently. Um, he's a retired Gonzaga instructor of political science and a retired attorney at law. He will speak on a montage, I like that word, montage, of 3 modern-day challenges: climate change, racism, and democratic rule. So with that, I'll let him go ahead. Thanks,
Thanks
for being here.
I'm glad we had a whole hour to cover such easy subjects. I was asked to kind of bring you up to date a little bit and give you a status report on the status of each of those issues and how they impact us, and then talk a little bit about some of the things that maybe we can do to make some contributions to each of these things. So first, let's start talking about climate change. We have known since the 1970s that burning of fossil fuels was the primary contributor to climate change in the United States and in the world. When we burn oil, natural gas, and coal, they release large amounts of carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas. Greenhouse gases trap heat in the atmosphere. Since the beginning of the industrial age, the average global temperature has increased 1 degree centigrade. Studies and computer simulations show that warming above 1 degree centigrade risks a significant increase in extreme weather, and that is exactly what we are experiencing now. We will also have significant increases in extreme weather, sea level rise, biodiversity loss, and species extinction, as well as food scarcity, which is already beginning to manifest itself. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has concluded that, quote, emissions from fossil fuels are the dominant cause of global warming, end quote. In 2018, 89% of global CO2 emissions came from the burning of fossil fuels in the fossil fuel industry. The World Wildlife Fund monitors about 32,000 populations, more than 5,000 species, about how they are faring by measuring their population growth and decline. They concluded in 2022 that climate change is likely to become the dominant cause of biodiversity loss in the coming decades. Regarding the impact on biodiversity, according to the Living Planet report issued by the World Wildlife Fund, the world's populations of wild mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish have declined by more than 2/3 on average since 1970. How will that affect our daily lives? Washington Post reported on October 11th of 2022 that the UN Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Societies report that by the year 2100, extreme heat events will make parts of Asia and Africa uninhabitable for up to 600 million people. Projected death rates from heat waves alone are, quote, staggeringly high, end quote. Projected death rates are comparable to all cancers or all infectious diseases in the world. What about today? In March of 2022, India and Pakistan's temperatures reached 117 degrees. In 2021, parts of the Middle East topped 125 degrees during a heat wave. In 2016, a town in Kuwait reached 129 degrees. One study predicted median temperatures in the Middle East could reach 130 to 145 degrees on average by the end of the century. But these effects will also be felt here in the United States. Imagine what will happen if the temperatures rise to that degree in that part of the world. Human beings cannot adapt to that. We cannot live in that kind of temperature. There will be mass migrations of people that have entirely different value systems and structures. And where will they go? Where it's cooler, Europe, okay? So we will see wars at that time over the land and over how to assimilate this huge number of migratory people that are going to be coming into the European continent. Washington Post further reported that extreme heat waves will make parts of the United States, including Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and parts of California, less suitable for human habitation by 2070. Won't even wait until the end of the century. The UN report also observed that food supplies will be disrupted, potentially contributing to price volatility for staple crops like wheat. We've already seen that just a little bit when we look at what happened when Ukraine war started. Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, and when they had their supplies of grain disrupted, look what happened to the price of wheat in the world. Imagine what it's going to be like when we can't grow the wheat in many parts of the world. The price is going to be skyrocketing. The UN concluded, let's be clear, this is not a problem that humanitarian organizations can solve alone. The urgent priority must be large and sustained investments that mitigate climate change and support long-term adaptation for the most vulnerable people, especially those that live in the third world. Efforts to begin to combat climate change by moving away from fossil fuels started back in the 1970s under the Jimmy Carter administration. On June 20th of 1979, President Carter installed 32 solar panels on the White House roof. At the dedication, he predicted, in the year 2000, this solar water heater behind me will still be supplying cheap, efficient energy. A generation from now, this solar heater can be either a curiosity, a museum piece, an example of a road not taken, or it can be just a small part of one of the greatest and most exciting adventures ever undertaken by the American people.
It was removed by President Reagan, wasn't it?
That's the next comment.
Oh, excuse me.
In 1986, the Reagan administration dismantled these solar panels and severely curtailed the research and development budgets for renewable energy and eliminated the tax breaks that had been created to spur the development of both solar and wind technologies, while officially recommitting the United States to formally adopt fossil fuels as our main source of energy. As a result, while President Carter set a goal of deriving 20% of the United States energy needs from renewable energy sources by the year 2000, that did not occur. Today, the United States gets 7% of its energy from renewables, mostly hydroelectric dams. Solar, thermal, and photovoltaic technology combined provide less than 1/10 of 1% of our energy needs. Had we stayed with those solar panels, how much closer would we be to where we needed to be today? Conservative politicians in the United States are the last obstacle to addressing this problem, and they are out of lockstep with the conservative movements in Europe and the rest of the world. They continue to deny the science of climate change and the overwhelming consensus within the scientific community that the warming is caused by human beings, and they continue to oppose significant climate change legislation. These are the consequences of exceeding the 1.5 degree threshold level. We are currently at 1.1 degrees. If we exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius, this is what we will experience. Significant biodiversity loss of both plants and animals, loss of significant populations of birds, fish, and mammals, increased intensity and frequency of natural disasters such as floods, hurricanes, droughts, heat waves, and wildfires, significant sea level rise, 1 meter or over 3 feet by 2100, and the death or the lack of growing in our forests. Those are the consequences if we don't do something. Biodiversity loss alone reduces the ecosystem that we rely on for food, shelter, and healthcare. For example, biodiverse flora and fauna provide extensive benefits to pharmacological sciences and our medicines. I believe the increased adverse weather that we have been experiencing is the planet fighting back. And science tells us that the intensity and magnitude of the planet's negative response to what we are doing is only going to accelerate in the future. Climate change is happening so fast now, many species simply cannot adapt quick enough to do it. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a collaboration of 270 scientists from 60 countries. They issued a report on April 4th of 2022, which, quote, warned of catastrophic results for the global climate if the world reaches average temperatures of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The World Research Institute confirms that global temperatures have now risen 1.1 degrees, and we are already seeing increased intensity and frequency of natural disasters like floods, hurricanes, and similar events. The UN reported that the current warming process will cause forests to die or stop growing. It will cause sea levels to rise. The report concluded that despite governmental goals internationally, fossil fuel emission rates are now above pre-pandemic levels. So despite everything that the world has done, we are now above where we were spewing this stuff into the atmosphere before we locked our societies down for 2 years. So clearly the commitments made by the United States and the rest of the world are not sufficient to keep us from hitting that 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. The past 7 years are the hottest on record in the world in history. Floods, droughts, heat waves, extreme storms, and wildfires are going from bad to worse. The report concludes there is nothing natural about the new scale of disasters. They are the price of humanity's fossil fuel addiction. End quote. In response to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report in 2022, Secretary General of the United Nations Antonio Guterres said the following: the IPCC Working Group 1 report is a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning and deforestation are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk. End quote. What about the oil companies? Exxon and other oil companies spent millions of dollars on think tanks to promote climate denial and have used misinformation and deception for decades in a campaign that looks like the smoking misinformation campaign that was launched and held to for decades by the tobacco industry. Shannon Hill reported in the Scientific American on October 26th of 2015 that the fossil fuel industry has lied to us for almost 40 years about climate change. In an 8-month investigation by reporters at Inside Climate News, they interviewed former Exxon employees, scientists, and federal officials and analyzed hundreds of pages of internal documents. They found that the company's knowledge of climate change dates to July of 1977, when senior scientist James Black reported to Exxon the following: in the first place, there is general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels. This is the lead scientist for Exxon. A year later, he warned Exxon that doubling CO2 gases in the atmosphere would increase average global temperatures by 2 to 3 degrees, a number that is consistent with the scientific consensus today. An energy company coalition memo was found among the materials that were retrieved from the oil companies. And one of the internal memos from the coalition of oil companies that was found said this, quote, victory for the oil companies will be achieved when the average person is uncertain about climate science. There's been a massive campaign, much like there was undertaken by the tobacco industry, to keep all of us in the dark, or at least questioning the science of climate change. There is no reason to question science change. We have to begin to believe our lying eyes at some point. Okay. In the summer of 2015, the Union of Concerned Scientists released a complementary investigation of their own to piece together Exxon's misinformation campaign. We included in our report this memo where victory will be achieved when the average person is uncertain about climate science. And that's exactly the goal. And that was exactly what they accomplished in the United States. Despite all the clients, conferences, and pledges to do better, I do not believe the world is going to meet its goals of curbing climate change beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think we're going to have to learn to live with the consequences of that. I do not see efforts undertaken at this point in time that are going to get us there, quite frankly. But, that having been said, there are signs of progress. Congress just passed the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which includes $370 billion in clean energy and climate investments over the next 10 years, primarily for the conversion of our economy to a sustainable energy and electric process. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was signed in 2021 includes billions more to modernize the electric grid, build a nationwide network of electric vehicle chargers, strengthen the battery supply chains, expand transit and rail, and invest in new and clean energy and emission reduction technologies as a complement to the Inflation Reduction Act. The world is increasingly investing in wind and solar energy with the goal of moving away from fossil fuels and embracing renewable sources of energy, while also engaging in discussions to help the third world cope with the changes that are coming in climate change. That's an important ethical consideration for those of us in the developed world. These consequences are primarily going to be felt in the third world. Primarily, the third world is not responsible for the CO2 that has gone into the atmosphere, but they will pay the price for our development in the developed first world. And they are now asking the first world to begin to set money aside to help them deal with the coming changes. However, these efforts amount to an historic investment in the fight against worsening climate change. And while our citizens' willingness to recycle and turn to electric vehicles is increasing, again, I don't think it's going to make the difference that it needs to, unless our politicians become committed to solving this problem. That's where we come in as voters. I've seen some estimates that put current climate change damage at over $200 million a day in the United States. A recent issue of the science magazine Discover reported that the cost of global warming to the United States by the year 2100 will be $2 trillion. We should have been spending that $2 trillion now to change the way this is going to play out in the future. We have chosen not to do that in the United States. It is important for the United States to lead the world in this regard, as we are the chief creator of CO2 gases going into the atmosphere. China, India, and Brazil, along with other developed countries, have joined in on the problem, but it is a lack of leadership from the United States that is hampering the international efforts to reach the goals that we all agree need to be reached. The second issue I want to talk about is racism. In discussions about race relations, it's too common to focus initially on what still needs to be done. I wanted to change that up today and talk first about some of the progress that we have made. The Brookings Institution reported in 1998 that in 1940, 60% of black women were domestic servants in the United States. By 1998, 60% held white-collar jobs. In 1958, 44% of whites said they would move if a black family became their next-door neighbor. In 1998, the figure was 1%. In 1964, only 18% of whites claimed to have a black friend. Today it is 86%, with 87% of blacks asserting that they have white friends. From 1940 to 1970, black men cut the income gap by about a third. And by 1970, they were earning on average roughly 60% of what white men were earning. Black women were even more impressive. Black life expectancy went up dramatically, as did black homeownership rates. Black college enrollment rose by 1970 to 10% of the total. But while the fraction of black families with middle-class incomes rose almost 40 percentage points between 1940 and 1970, since 1970, it has only inched up another 10 points. Studies have shown that virtually no improvement occurred in the wages of black men relative to those of white men outside of the South over the period 63 to 87. The biggest gains were in the South, and that was because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act with its powerful anti-discrimination provisions, which we now credit with most of the growth that we are experiencing in that community. And finally, we have elected our first black president, and now we have our first black vice president. But in my opinion, and that of many sociologists who have visited this subject, it is precisely the election of that African-American president that opened the door for the growing racist elements in the United States. In my research of white hate groups, I learned that a decades-long expansion of US-based hate groups slowed to a crawl during the first year of President Trump's administration, which seemed to me to be a positive until I read the reasons for the changes in this trend. Dr. David Cunningham, a professor of sociology and an expert on the Ku Klux Klan and other hate-based social movements, analyzed the modern data and found that hate groups used perceived threats to white supremacy to quickly expand their ranks during the Obama administration, when some suggested that we were in the process of beginning to enter a post-racial America. These threats began to fade for hate groups at the end of Obama's presidency. Professor Cunningham concluded that in the political climate of that time, the perceived cost of committing hate crimes was lessened by President Trump's unwillingness to condemn the violent acts of white nationalists, as happened following the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville at the beginning of his presidency. Professor Cunningham observed that emboldened white nationalists are drawing on the organizational infrastructure they developed over the past 2 decades to more openly advance their agendas. He notes that after decades of lurking in the shadows, extreme factions of alt-right and white nationalist movements viewed the Trump presidency as a, quote, get active opportunity, end quote, as they pursued anti-immigrant, anti-black, and anti-Muslim hate crimes. Professor Cunningham ties of this to the prior administration stem from his research into these groups, and he concludes his report by observing, quote, the Trump campaign and presidency has created this license when referring to these efforts by these hate groups. He noted in his report that more than 1/3 of post-election hate crimes invoked the president and his campaign slogans. Clearly, we need to understand that what our political leaders say or don't say has a significant impact on how millions of people in this country behave. We have to think about that the next time we go to the ballot box. Since 2000, black men have experienced an unemployment rate roughly double that of white men. The Brookings Institute concludes that this confirms that there is consistent and significant gap in median weekly earnings and average unemployment between black men and their white counterparts, and that hasn't changed for decades. So what are the circumstances that create the disparities? The Brookings Institute reported that black men are born into black households whose wealth has, on average since 1983, been eclipsed by that of white households by a ratio of 10 to 1. A 2019 study by Sanaz Mobasseri, published in the American Journal of Sociology, confirmed that when black males look for employment, they are 11 to 12% less likely to get a call back than white applicants with similar resumes. Richard Reeves, a senior fellow in economic studies with the Brookings Institute, noted that the lower rates of upward mobility among black men, caused by a range of impediments in generating income and wealth, have delayed the economic ascent of black men by a century. In other words, it will take black men up to 100 years to catch up to the economic mobility currently enjoyed by white men if we don't change. Progress in race relations will require tackling racism, whether it's structural, institutional, or systemic. For me, structural and systemic racism are the most insidious because it bakes into the social structure mechanisms of discrimination, and it continues to cause harm, despite the fact that we are individually becoming less racist. While we are individually becoming less racist, our institutions are continuing to be racist in the way that they operate as they were originally designed. Well, what exactly is structural racism? Structural racism refers to a system of structures that have procedures or processes that disadvantage African American and other racial groups. It refers to rules, practices, and customs rooted in law with residual effects that reverberate throughout society. These structures include the banking system, educational system, election system, and justice system, and many other systems that we haven't talked about. Well, let's take some examples of where those systems have operated. Redlining was used by banks and real estate industry to outline in red ink the neighborhoods where people of color lived. If you lived inside those red lines, bank loans were considered risky and caused banks to withhold those loans and their investment in communities of color. If you lived, while this practice was banned in 1968, the consequences are stark. According to the Federal Reserve Board, the net worth of a typical white family is $171,000. That is 10 times greater than the net worth of a black family. The situation is exacerbated when you consider that the suppression of the value of homes in black neighborhoods also causes those neighborhoods' property tax base to fall, meaning less tax dollars for schools, fewer kindergartens, fewer qualified teachers, and few AP classes, adversely affecting their educational opportunity. According to the National Center for Education Studies, African Americans have lower graduation rates from high school, and even fewer go on to graduate from college. Black and brown people account for 30% of the US population, but FBI statistics show that they account for 43% of people killed by police and more than 1/2 of the total incarcerated population in the United States. Black men account for 6% of the US population, but are 32% of the 1.4 million American men who are incarcerated. Statistics suggest that 1 in 3 black men will be imprisoned, and nearly 1/2 of black women have a family member or extended family member in prison. The stigmatization of being an ex-con has profound impacts on the ability of these men to work and earn wealth when they are released from prison. Police violence is one of the leading causes of death for black men. In 2022, 220 African American men were killed by police. The rate of fatal police shootings among black Americans was higher for African Americans than for any other ethnicity. Statistics show that black victims killed by police are more likely than white victims to be unarmed, confirming the disparate treatment of the race. Some of you have heard this story before, but I think it's helpful to hear it within the context of what we're talking about here. Some years ago, I and another attorney were out in one of our counties west of Spokane for a hearing on a case where we were both co-counsel. There was a criminal sentencing ahead of us in which a local Hispanic farm worker was accused of stealing a garden hose. He spoke no English. The prosecuting attorney asked the judge for a sentence of 1 year in jail, followed by deportation for the theft of a garden hose. I remember Jack and I turning to look at each other with raised eyebrows at this request for a simple theft. We thought surely the defense attorney would object to such an outrageous request by the government's attorney. Then the defense attorney said he had no objection. Both Jack and I nearly came out of our chairs to object, but we didn't. To have done so would have resulted in financial sanctions for both of us, a probable bar complaint by the judge to the Bar Association, and a likely contempt citation from the judge, to say nothing of the potential to piss him off when he got to our case. Each of these reasons for failing to act on my part was due to a systemic practice or rule. Those rules and practices are in place to ensure an orderly courtroom, and the penalty for violating them is high. But that is exactly what I should have done. I don't know what became of that man. I know he had a family and was working to support them. If I was still practicing, and such a situation was presented to me again, I would take the sanctions and the bar complaint as a fair cost of injecting myself into a situation in which I was not the attorney of record. And I would object respectfully, but with conviction. What are some of the mechanisms that are used to structurally discriminate against Black, brown, and minority citizens? Rules at school and in the workplace that don't allow for dreadlocks, cornrows, and braids discriminates against minority folks vis-a-vis their physical traits. The use of voter suppression laws and racial gerrymandering are political tools used to continue racial oppression of minority folks in this country. While the 1968 Fair Housing Act outlawed our extensive experience with Jim Crow and the discrimination across the country, the early half century found the United States to be one of the most segregated countries in the world. The GI Bill was designed, for example, to give returning veterans from World War II a leg up into the job market through educational opportunities. It is credited with creating America's middle class, but only for white America. While the money for the program was federal, the administration and management of the program was given to the states. The southern states effectively ignored Black GIs who sought those same benefits. Racism denied Black veterans an opportunity to join the new middle class alongside with white America. We move towards racial progress when we individually get to a point where we are willing to confront systemic racism with a formal objection to it. If we fail to object, the harm is being done, and it will continue to be done. In a survey from the Pew Research Center in 2020, following the death of George Floyd, a majority of Black adults, 56%, felt that the added attention to issues of race and equality following the protests sparked by the killing of Mr. Floyd would lead to changes that would positively impact the Black community. Then a new survey, a year later, of 3,912 Black Americans in October of 2021 found that 2/3 said that the recent increased focus on race and racial inequality in the United States has not led to changes that are improving the lives of Black people. 82% of those surveyed nationwide considered racism a major problem for Black people in the United States. 79%, or 8 in 10 Black Americans, reported having personally experienced discrimination because of their race or ethnicity. Out of 6 issues tested in the survey, 63%, almost 2/3 of Black adults surveyed, said racism is an extremely big problem for Black Americans, while 60% said the same of police brutality, 54% of economic inequality, 47% the affordability of health care, 46% restricting of voting, and 40% the quality of K-12 schools. 52% of Black adults say that racism in the law is a bigger problem than racism by individual people. The structures that we have created are not following our individual growth as anti-racists. They have to be changed. They have to be changed. This tells me that we're making racial progress on an individual level, but not on a systemic level. Most Black Americans say that major changes are needed, especially in regards to the criminal justice system, policing, or the courts. Our education system can't be ignored either, since Black college graduates on average hold nearly $25,000 more in student loans than white students. In October of 2022, an NAACP survey found that 44%, almost half of respondents, believe racism and discrimination to be the most important issues facing the Black community today. because it leads to fewer job opportunities, economic insecurity, healthcare inequities, and voter suppression. What can individually be done to help move the racial dial towards more equitable treatment? I've given you a handout which will give you some suggestions on how to be an anti-racist. I could get somebody to hand those out for me. Thank you, Pippi. Just highlight a couple of them that are particularly important. As white folks, we need to accept the concept of privilege. We have to accept the concept of white privilege. Okay? I, for example, have never driven down the street and worried about a police car behind me. I have never worried about my race being an issue when I went to get a bank loan. I've never worried about my race being an issue in anything that I have done, because I am a very privileged person. You are looking at the most privileged person in America, a professional white male. Okay? That has to be shared with everybody else. Be prepared to vote against someone who doesn't support reasonable efforts to combat racism, and then tell them so in writing. Support the businesses of black-owned owners. Read and talk to your kids and grandkids about race, and be their anti-racist role model. Gently but firmly engage family members and friends who exhibit racially insensitive behaviors or use insensitive language, using non-judgmental language in a private setting away from others. Believe the survivors of racism. When someone identifies a racist incident that they experienced, your response would be, "I'm so sorry that happened. Thank you for telling me. How can I help?" It's a very simple response. Things don't change without sustained and genuine pressure to motivate that change. That's especially true of systems and institutions. I've given you this handout from my anti-racism class, which will give you some additional suggestions you can take home. My final topic is on democracy, or better still, democracy under siege. I want to look at this topic in two ways. I want to look at the most recent threat to democratic rule at the federal level in the United States, and then I'll take a look at democratic rule and how it's being usurped at the state level through restrictive voter ID laws. On the last day of the U.S. Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where the founders were debating the form of government the United States was going to adopt, in response to a question by a lady who asked whether we had a republic or a monarchy, Benjamin Franklin responded, quote, "A republic, if you can keep it," end quote. That's where we begin our discussion. Since the Civil War, we have largely lived as though our democratic form of government was a given, something that we took for granted. That changed on January 6th of 2021, when a mob of President Trump's supporters stormed the Capitol to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. If you paid any attention to the January 6th hearings, you would know how close we came to losing our republic. On that date, we experienced an attempted coup d'etat, where for the first time in our history, a former president attempted to retain power despite losing the presidential election. This is what Benjamin Franklin was talking about. Bipartisan hearings by the House of Representatives evaluated what had happened on January 6th, and it resulted in some key recommendations. Some of those recommendations are that the Justice Department pursue criminal charges against former President Trump, and that Congress bar him from running for office again pursuant to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. That the Vice President's role in the transfer of power is ceremonial. Recommended stronger penalties for those who obstruct the peaceful transfer of power. Asked for increased penalties for threatening election workers. Asked for new legislation to compel the recipients of congressional subpoenas to actually appear before Congress. What a novel idea. And recommended that there be more oversight of our Capitol Police. At those same hearings, A conservative retired federal judge, J. Michael Ludick, testified as follows, quote, "Our democracy is on a knife's edge," unquote. Well, why did the insurrection fail? Because our democratic institutions and systems held. And that was because of dedicated election workers and officials involved in the state's election systems who chose to honor their oaths of office instead of go along with the insurrection. We owe a debt of gratitude to the numerous Republican election workers and elected officials at the state level across the country, especially in Georgia, Arizona, and Pennsylvania, who refused to assist in the insurrection on January 6th. For us, despite dodging a bullet, there continue to be efforts in this country by some involved in the January 6th coup to get more sympathetic local election workers elected or put into places of influence for future elections. The good news is that most of them who ran in the midterm elections lost. The bad news is that they are not done. They will adapt their approach and they will continue. So while the Republic survived, the forces that were at work on January 6th in this country are alive and well in the United States, and we ignore them at our peril. Last month, President Bolsonaro lost the presidency of Brazil to President Lula. That defeat was met with an insurrection attempt in the capital city of Brazil that looked eerily like our capital did on January 6th. There are powerful anti-democratic forces in the world and in our country that we choose to ignore at our peril. We have now exported this to another country. January 6th is important for our purposes today because it highlights how fragile our relationship with democracy is in modern America and how important it is that we nurture it. It should cause all of us to reflect on the importance of having election officials at the state level committed to the basic democratic principles of the American election process. When you vote, you should explore and evaluate these candidates to confirm that they will honor their oath to uphold the integrity of the election systems. We need to seek ways to improve the electoral system so it works for all Americans, or we risk losing the most important right we as citizens have, the right to vote. The right to vote and make decisions over how the trajectory of our country is going to be decided. One of the most significant shortcomings is the effort in dozens of states to restrict or curtail the right of minority brothers and sisters to fully participate in the process. Slide 14 shows us what is happening. We're talking about the suppression of minority votes in the country. Voter suppression in our history and politics is any legal or extra-legal measure or strategy whose purpose or practical effect is to reduce voting or registering to vote by members of a targeted racial group, political party, or religious community. After the 2012 elections, for the first time since the peak of the Jim Crow era, states across the United States began to enact laws making it more difficult for minorities to vote as a backlash against the rising turnout among communities of color, contributing to the election of the nation's first black president. Efforts to suppress the votes of communities of color accelerated in 2013 when the Supreme Court eliminated a key provision in Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There is a large and growing pile of evidence that strict voter ID laws disproportionately impact voters of color. The Brennan Center for Justice on January 10th of 2022 published an analysis of some of the research findings of multiple studies in the United States. Some key findings included the following. Turnout data around the United States demonstrated that the racial turnout gap grew when states enacted strict voter ID laws. A study of the Texas voter ID law concluded that strict identification laws will stop significant number of voters from voting. In one study I saw, it said that Texas's law will deny access to the polls for an estimated 200,000 Texans, most of color. Restrictions on Sunday voting, as proposed in Texas and Georgia, disproportionately hurts voters of color. Reducing the number of voting machines in predominantly African American neighborhoods, along with limiting weekend voting and restrictions on mail-in voting, all contribute to long lines of African American voters we see on the news every election cycle. Some wait for 8 hours or more to vote. Studies of cell phone data demonstrate that voters of color wait longer to vote in neighborhoods with more racial and ethnic minorities than is the case in predominantly white neighborhoods. So how does a voter who works vote under those conditions? To exacerbate the problem, many of these states have also adopted a significant rule as to how an individual can be given the right to vote in the first place, which have further hampered the ability of Black America to participate. The Brennan Research Group's data confirmed that African American mail-in ballots were rejected at much higher rates than those of white voters in Florida in 2018 and Georgia in 2020. An analysis of voting in Georgia in 2022 revealed that the turnout for African American voters went down while white turnout went up. The law has been challenged in court by the U.S. Justice Department and others, alleging reducing polling sites, limiting mail-in ballots, and drop boxes unfairly restricted minority voting. Ethnic Media Services reported in October of 2022 that the dozens of new voter laws nationwide, of those laws, the Texas law passed in 2021 is the most repressive. Data from the first statewide primary shows that just one provision of the new Texas law caused massive disenfranchisement and major racial disparities in the state. Absentee applications for ballots and mail ballots were rejected at, quote, extremely high levels, end quote, resulting in the rejection of 12,000 applications to vote and applications for a ballot of 25,000 ballots were ignored. That is a 12% rejection rate statewide compared to a 1% rejection rate prior to the passing of the Texas law. The Brennan Center concluded that this combination of application and mail ballot rejections left non-white voters in Texas at least 30% more likely to have an application for a ballot or a mail ballot rejected than for white voters. Most of these laws were passed ostensibly to combat massive voter fraud alleged to have occurred in the last presidential election. None of it existed to any significant degree, according to numerous studies. After the 2020 election, a months-long analysis by the Associated Press found fewer than 475 cases of potential voter fraud in the 6 battleground states challenged by President Trump after the presidential election. Out of over 3.3 million votes cast for president in Arizona alone, only 198 cases of potential fraud were identified, and the AP analysis found no signs of a coordinated effort to fraudulently vote. Professor Levitt at Loyola Law School and a White House senior policy advisor for democracy and voting rights only found 31 credible cases of voter impersonation between the years 2000 and 2014 out of 1 billion ballots reviewed. The Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative organization, its database includes 1,296 of proven instances of voter fraud out of the hundreds of millions of votes cast going back to 1992. Of those, 1,120 resulted in criminal convictions. The reality is that these laws are being passed to peel off voters who tend to vote contrary to the powers that be in our conservative states. With our elections coming down to incredibly close results, the disenfranchisement of even a small number of minority voters can preserve white control in each of those states. We are blessed in the state of Washington with a system that works really well. The problems that were supposed to be addressed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965 aimed at eliminating race discrimination against minority voters was effective until the year 2013, when it was gutted by the United States Supreme Court in the Shelby County versus Holder decision. That law required that the states and localities who had a demonstrated history of racial discrimination in voting had to submit any proposed changes in their voting laws first to the federal government before they could enter them into their state legislatures. The reason for that pre-clearance formula was to ensure that the proposed changes were not going to be against the minorities of the state. Then the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision in Shelby versus Holder in 2013, held that the states and localities who used to be required to get federal approval of any law affecting voting because of their history of racial discrimination before they could change their laws no longer had to. Within 24 hours of that ruling, Texas announced that it would implement a strict photo ID law, and Mississippi and Alabama began to enforce photo ID laws that had previously been barred because of the federal pre-clearance rules of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. North Carolina enacted a voter ID bill that curtailed early voting, eliminated same-day registration, restricted pre-registration, ended annual voter registration drives, and eliminated the authority of the county boards of elections to keep the polls open for an additional hour. A federal court would later strike down the North Carolina law because it was, in the words of the court, quote, designed to target African Americans with almost surgical precision, end quote. Georgia's Election Integrity Act of 2021 makes it illegal for anyone except poll workers to provide food or water to voters in line. I am at a loss to understand the electoral goal of that provision, other than to make standing in line that much more miserable and incentivize that much more that people not stand in line. Other states that were previously covered by the act purged voters off their rolls at a significantly higher rate than non-covered jurisdictions. After the Shelby ruling, by 2018, there were 1,688 polling place closures in states previously covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. I suspect everybody in this room knows which neighborhoods those polls were closed. Fortunately, the courts have been willing to step in when some of these laws became manifestly egregious. But the states simply jigger the unconstitutional law and repass it in the next legislature. And now we have another couple of years before we can actually effectively challenge the law. These are intentional efforts to restrict the right of minority voters to fully participate in American democracy in order to preserve predominantly white power structures in the states. My hope with this class is that you have been introduced and reminded of some things that will provoke your thought process and challenge you to think of ways that you can personally respond to these and other issues. To just dissuade us from any thought that we in Spokane certainly would not have any of these same kind of problems, I want to hand out an opinion piece from Wednesday, February 1st in the Spokesman Review, which talked about how Black Americans in the city of Spokane have been treated who jaywalk. They're not treated the same as you and I. Climate change poses an existential threat to life on this planet as we know it. The racism that was put into a bottle prior to 2016 has escaped, and it's returned to victimize every ethnic, social, and racial minority in the United States. Voting is a critical component to preserving a vibrant democracy, and it is under siege. In a pluralistic society like ours with lots of voices and cultures, it's critical that all of those voices have access to the ballot box. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to entertain. Any questions?
Don't you think things are better though?
Some things are better.
Yeah.
Yeah, some things are better. I think on a personal level, things are better. each of us, I think, have progressed and come to a place in our growth as a society that is really a positive thing. I think the statistics show that we made that progress, but we have forgotten a whole bunch of things that have significant impacts on minority communities, such as the way our systems are worked, the rules that we use to govern them, and all of those things. Those have not been changed to follow the changes that we have personally undertaken for ourselves. And as long as those continue to be the way they are, we're going to continue to have these consequences. Eric?
You mean to tell me these jaywalking laws, that means if you're a minority, if you're out walking about, like walking to a store or walking about in the city, you could get arrested for being a minority, for being black?
No, the article talks about jaywalking on the streets. And the question that's being asked is it time to eliminate jaywalking as an offense, given the disparate disparity in how we handle people that are guilty?
What's the difference between going out for a walk and jaywalking?
Going across the street against not in a crosswalk or against the light. That's what they're talking about, jaywalking.
Oh, not going with the crosswalk and simply just crossing the street.
Cutting across the street, correct. That's right.
But,
I just wondered what your thoughts are in regard to progress being made with nuclear power to get rid of some of this fossil fuels.
You know, I suspect that the pressure is going to grow for that to be one of the alternatives that we use. I can see that. I'm not in favor of it because the consequences of fission power in the country are only going to exacerbate the tremendous problem we have with the waste that is created. My hope is that the work that they're doing on the fusion reactor is going to come along in the next 10 or so years and actually be a viable source of power. But I'm not a real keen person on fission power. I think what we need to do is to go all in on the renewables like solar and wind. Yeah.
talking about jaywalking, if you jaywalk like if you walk from across the street from one place to another, if you live in a neighborhood where the streets are less busy, is one thing. But if you're out in North Division and you crossing. One time I saw this person that was crossing North Division, going from one place to another, crossing the street from North Division without no crosswalk, and also it happened in the morning, it happened in the dark while I was on my way to work. And to me, that can be when you're crossing North Division, especially if it's dark outside and you're on your way there. That can be kind of nerve-wracking when you cross the street without no crosswalk and all.
Well, and that's part of the debate. You know, part of the debate is there enough of a value associated with making jaywalking illegal compared to the value of it? Is there enough value to justify it compared to the consequences that are being visited upon persons of color? That's part of the debate.
Oh,
Yes.
What would you say on the connection between racism and our climate issues? I know you talk a lot about the connection between the issues with our democracy and racism. What would you have any? You provided a lot of good stats. Do you have anything on the connection between racism and climate change?
And racism and what?
Climate change.
And climate change? Yes, I think if you look at the places, for example, that we put our garbage dumps and our waste disposal places, they tend to be generally located near communities of color, okay, because they don't have the political power to keep it from being located there. There are connections between racism and climate change. I'm not even able to identify them with specificity now, but there definitely are. The way that we approach climate change and so forth is going to be racist in some respects unless we choose to implement those approaches with a different eye and we have a different structure used. The black surveys that I have read suggest that a minimum of 45% of black America feels that most of those systems need to be completely rehauled in order for them to be fair. Yes?
So I know of some organizations and groups like the ACLU of Washington and like 350 Spokane, things that are groups that provide information. Do you know of other groups in Washington that we can hear about upcoming bills or things that are being like passed that relate to these issues?
You can Google online, go to Washington State Legislature, pending bills, and you should be able to pull up some stuff about what's going on in the various committees. That would be my best response, yeah. And there are a couple that are currently real interesting right now.
Yeah.
I appreciate all the information about clarifying structural racism and all of the practices. It's really helpful to understand that better. I'm looking also at the success of the disinformation that has been passed around with social media and TV and all that kind of stuff. And I do wonder if that also is an impact of, it seems, like critical thinking, like the ability to do that, and if that's something that you feel has lessened over the K-12 kind of system, and I mean, I'm in education too, so I do see some of that. I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
When I taught at Gonzaga, we were really into critical thinking and teaching that, because that really is an antidote to a lot of the misinformation that's out there. But my experience is that we have become much less interested in being critical thinkers. We are much more interested in having something tell us what the problem is and what the solution is, and our attention span has been reduced from 14 seconds 15 years ago to about 7 seconds today. So we're willing to listen to a message that might assist us for 7 seconds, and after that our mind kind of goes off on a tangent. So how do we get critical thinking taught to people who can't even attend to an attention span that is more than a few seconds in duration? It requires energy and effort, and most of us are simply not willing to put in the energy or effort to do that. We read something and we take it at face value because it fits our ideological belief, whether on the left or the right. We're both guilty of it. And instead of taking that and then going and doing a quick Google search and reading a few articles on it, we don't do that. If we did, it would contribute to the development of our critical thinking ability.
So, in your opinion, is the United States going to become more divided in all these issues, or are we going to come into the point where we start to unite again, where we're not as pissed off at each other and divided and all this other stuff?
I think it depends on the area that we're talking in. I think in the area of climate change, I think most people in the United States now are believing their lying eyes and are beginning to understand that there is something happening, and that now the big question I think among most of us is it a natural thing, a part of the normal structure, or is it in fact something that we are causing? A recognition that it is something being caused by our behavior, I think, will work well in trying to get people to coalesce around solutions to that problem. But unfortunately, we are no longer a country of planners. We are a country that does policy on the basis of crisis. We wait until something is terrible before we pass laws to try to fix it. We used to be able to say, hey, this is coming down the road. President Carter saw what was coming down the road. The man had a background in physics. And yet here we are, years and years later, with 1/10 of 1% of our power being generated by sustainable energy. And so I think it's going to take crises in race relations as well that are going to finally promote some kind of change. I really thought, along with the majority in the black community, that with all of the protest march and demonstrations that came across after the Gardner killing, I thought surely political people would catch that and would do something. And there were a few things that were done, but it was just nothing compared to what needs to be done to change that. So in regards to your question, I don't know what it's going to take to get our political people to change. We've got a whole raft of people in Congress right now that have no interest in doing anything in civil rights, that have no interest in doing anything in climate change. And so how you get to them, it's got to come down to the voters. If we do not insist at the ballot box on electing Democrats and Republicans that are for a pluralistic society, believe in climate change and know we need to do something about it, we're going to continue to have these problems. That's the best I can say.
So as a follow-up, I think I know the answer, but what is your view or your opinion in the words "Make America Great Again"?
What was the question again?
So I think I know the answer. I think I've I kind of understand it. But in your view, what is the definition, or what is "Make America Great Again"? What does that?
What does that stand for? For me personally,
Yeah.
I have a very ideological attitude towards that. My attitude is let's make America white again. That's what I view that as, and I think a lot of people do. We had a professor at Gonzaga's law school that objected to that being worn in his classroom by a student. And he was an African American professor, and it's clearly being used by that community as a cudgel, and a racial cudgel.
So what years was America great that we're not great now?
That's a really good question.
Yes, it is.
I personally think that this is the greatest country that has ever been on the planet. With all of the problems that we have, we are still the greatest country in the world. We fought fascism and defeated it in World War II. We have brought some of the greatest technological improvements to life. We have created medicine and medical technology that is just beyond compare anywhere. I think this is a great country. But we are not doing great things anymore. We don't build great things anymore. When was the last time we built a Hoover Dam or anything like that? We have convinced ourselves that we can't afford to do great things anymore. We've convinced ourselves that taxes are evil and therefore we shouldn't be spending tax dollars. And until that attitude changes, you're not going to see America becoming greater than it is now in the kinds of ways that I think it's capable of becoming. I think we're holding ourselves back significantly.
Yeah, because with the MAGA movement, my challenge is, I'm conservative, Republican, prior military officer, retired federal law enforcement. My dad was Republican. I'm kind of Reagan, Republican, McCain, Republican. So in this era of, people attacking the Capitol with American flag and beating each other, and then they have a rebel flag. That's my biggest challenge.
No question. I have to believe, or at least I want to believe, that that's an outlier. But I'm shocked at the number of our Congress people that were sympathetic with that. And the fact that over 100 members of the House of Representatives voted against certifying the election is just astonishing to me. It says that we as voters have failed ourselves.
Tom?
Yeah.
As a black person in America,
Pardon me?
I said as a black person in America, what's strange to you all has been my life. As any minority in America, we live this every day. What you have to remember is you're not responsible for the past, but you are responsible for the future. There is nothing, don't blame yourself for what came before you. You have to deal with now. And what hurts me, like Robert says, I was in the military. You took an oath. You've got people in Congress, they took an oath. This is a country, this is my country. Bad, good, indifferent. And as bad as it is, it's still better than a whole lot of places. You have to leave here to really appreciate what it is, even with its horrors. It's still a place to strive for. I'm saddened by people who are now in Congress that does not take their oath. In the military it says, I will defend this nation against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And if you took that oath, you wouldn't have the people like we got in Congress. We would not have had a January the 6th. People stood up and died for this country. You had guys who went Vietnam, and I think about that because I'm a Vietnam era vet, that came back and had such a horrible time. people acted like they were the ones that created the war. Politicians create the war. They never go to war. If I had a chance, every darn person who served in Congress would have to take their behind to war. You could not institute going to war if you hadn't been there, because most people who have been in war have no desire to do that again, to have to go through that. This country has so much potential. You know, don't put us against other countries, because they got the same problems. They have the same problems. But we can't get better. And I hate the loss of civility. Even when you used to disagree, you at least used to be able to have a conversation and get to where it's like, okay, well, we're just gonna agree to disagree, but we could still function. And now we're not functioning. I'm so scared. It's like, where could I go? Because the people we have in Congress now, the attitudes that they have, and people whose attention span is, you know, for me, Trump, Tucker Carlson, they're treasonous individuals because they have taken and facilitated use of disinformation for other countries to say Putin is whatever. You know, it's that this is great. But again, as a Black person in America, the things that you talked about is every day. Our prayer was, I've got a Black son, and if he's not in jail, we're doing good today. Is that something you would want to have to say? Is that something that you would even think about? If they go out in a car, it's like if they stop you, you hope, hey, put up your hands, don't argue, don't fuss. This is how we have to raise our Black children. This is how people who are Latin, who are Hispanic, who are Native American, who are Asian, have to think about how they raise their children in American society. Think about that. It's great, all this research in the world, but all the stuff they talk about, we already know. That's not something I need to know. People want to talk about not being racist. Do they actually know what a racist is? I can't be a racist. I can be prejudiced, I can be bigoted. To be a racist, I have to own the system. I don't own the system. Asians don't own the system. Hispanics don't own the system. They cannot be racist in America because we don't own the systems. And the systems are the things. The systems. And until we can work to change that, that's going to be a bigger thing. And what people don't understand is in this country, not just racism, but if you're poor, and people in power will work on the poor, but they will, in spite of their economics, they will play to their hatred, not thinking about what it's costing them economically. Their places that they live, that they're not having services. It's not just people of color who don't have services. Ask people in rural communities who are white. Ask them if they're poor. It's not just about me being Black. It's about anybody who is disadvantaged. And it's especially about people who are poor in the aggregate. When people get you, politicians get you hooked up on, oh, see, they're getting what you're not getting. Don't like them. And they use that for their power. But when we come to kind of get beyond that, and I pray that it will be, but who knows?
Thank you, Sandra. I appreciate what you're saying. I've had that conversation that Black parents have with their sons. I've had that with my son when he's out. I understand what you're saying. That is not how we should be living in this country. When you look at all of these problems, the bottom line is that the solution to every last one of these is an enhanced engagement in the problem by you and me as voters, as citizens, and as people that have vested interest in this all being better. If we choose to just vote because there's an R or a D behind their name, instead of whether or not they're for racial justice as well as for climate control and do something positive, I don't care if they're a D or an R, I'm not going to elect them, okay? We need to start looking at the world differently than we do now. And we need to be willing to commit ourselves, our personal time resources and our financial resources, to seeing that the people that can make the difference in a country like this, in a republic, are in a position of power to be able to do it. Because you and I are not going to be able to do it through the various things that we have access to, like our nonprofits and so forth. That's not going to get it done. It requires a sustained effort of government. That requires that we do things differently. Yes?
I really appreciate the flyers that you handed out. But this goes back to the climate change. So what can the average person do? I mean, I recycle. We can't afford solar panels, and there's not an electric car that can transport 7 of us. So, I feel it's a little fatalistic. I read in the newspaper or the news, this glacier has melted, is no longer gone. I'm like, I don't know what to do with this information. So
you really make a good point. I mean, sometimes the magnitude of the problem and the challenge keeps us from doing anything. It creates a paralysis in us as individuals. One of the ways that I've gotten away from that is that we do the recycling and so forth, but all that does is gets us in the game, okay? That's just the ticket of admission. But it's actually going out and being part of an organization that is devoted to doing some of those things and devoting my time and volunteering my effort and so forth to seeing that happens. Or I'm in the process right now with Roger Hudson of creating a new 501c3 that we're going to launch in May. And it's going to be designed to try to encourage a different way of thinking in Spokane. Tell a different story. Instead of the stories that humanity has traditionally told itself, we want to start telling a different story. So we're going to actually launch an organization on May 19th that tells a new story and changes a lot of how we approach all of these issues. So getting ourselves involved outside of just the recycling and so forth requires time and energy and so forth, but that's what it's going to take.
Real fast, I just want to make a plug for the Creation Care ministry team here at church.
There you go.
We have one, and there are about 5 of us that meet regularly. You've got the Dear Tara columns that we see every week or every other week. We were the people that got the waste baskets, the different colored waste baskets and stuff. We've got compostable stuff for the coffee services and stuff. We've actually taken a lot of steps, and we've targeted a lot of steps that need to be taken on the campus of the church. And we're always looking for new people. So speak to me, Peggy, Fleta, Pastor Megan, if that's something that you want to start taking action, doing in little steps. That's what we're working on right here at Covenant. So you are absolutely welcome to join.
One of the things we did at home in that regard is this was the first summer that I have not used chemicals on my lawn. I made the commitment that I was going to go out every day and I was going to pull dandelions and feed them to the chickens across the street. And I said I was going to go out there and I was going to rake the moss out and reseed it without going and getting the moss chemicals and putting that on them. So just little things like that, which signal a bit of a change in attitude, is really what we need in society, where we begin to look at things very differently. When we look at how we care for our grounds around the church, are we throwing chemicals and fertilizer on them, or are there other ways that maybe we should be doing it? It's a willingness to commit to living differently that I think in many respects is absent in this formula. Once we attain a critical mass of people that actually understand that what's happening is real and it's going to impact not maybe you personally, but your grandchildren and their grandchildren are going to live in a very, very different world than we live in today. We will see wars over water. They may be in Arizona and New Mexico in not very too much time, but we will see wars over water in the world. Thank you very much for all of your time. I appreciate it.